Industrial society brought many good things and many bad things to America. Immigrants got the worst end of the deal with terrible living and working conditions. In the 12 largest cities, 40% of the population were immigrants, and 60% of the workforce was foreign born. Corporations and politicians during this time were obsessed with upward mobility, and social reform was the last thing on their minds. Politics at this time were driven by bribes, including offering jobs in exchange for votes. During a depression from 1893 to 1896, Americans started to wonder if industry was good or bad for their lives, and many were realizing the true size and power of corporations. Progressives were questioning if the United States was the model society that they thought it was, and protesting the status quo was a daily occurrence. The Children's Bureau was established in 1912, and in 1916 child labor was restricted, but the Supreme Court ended up overturning this ruling. Juvenile courts were also created, which made incarcerating youth a better process, especially with the option of probation. Mothers' pensions were created and mostly used by widows, and this was a great alternative instead of having to move out of their homes with all of their children. The National Mental Health Committee was established to improve the treatment of people with mental illnesses. The 16th Amendment was passed, which created the federal income tax. This seemed like a great idea at the time to be able to afford some of these reforms. Children were dying in great numbers from influenza, whooping cough, measles, and scarlet fever, and nearly 20% of populations were killed from things like typhoid fever and malaria. Neither Republicans nor Democrats were concerned about the oppressed groups in America at this time, and Theodore Roosevelt ran on a third-party ticket and lost, even though he was very popular, proving how powerful the two main political parties had become. Many groups in America were oppressed at this time, including women. They engaged in political action and finally won the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920 with the help of powerful women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. African Americans were harmed under the Jim Crow laws in the South. The Supreme Court upheld these laws in 1896 with the Plessy v. Ferguson case. It was required to have separate but equal facilities for African Americans and whites. Asian immigrants were another vulnerable population at the time. The Chinese were banned from coming to the United States, and Japanese immigrants were excluded in 1907 by the Gentlemen's Agreement. Mexican immigrants were a huge workforce for farming and ranching, but were not viewed by Americans as worthy of rights. Many progressive ideas were not inclusive of outgroups, and one example is the Immigration Act of 1917, which required a literacy test to enter the country. Overall, regulations enacted in the progressive era include workers' compensation, the social work profession, women's suffrage, a national network of hospitals, and juvenile courts. While this was a great start for making our country a better place, it was nowhere near equality and justice for all.